Dr. Stillman, Bob, welcome to Inside Reproductive Health.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You know, there's a handful of people in the field that I didn't know before, either before the podcast or before we met, that had tried to reach out. And very often when people do try to reach out to me, they're trying to get me to sell something. So inevitably when somebody reaches out to me, I have a reaction of, gosh, what does this person want me to sell? And there's a handful of people that, you know, it wasn't about selling anything. It was about building a relationship and being on the same wavelength. And there's probably 2 or to 4 people that I can think of that it's like, man, I'm glad that I took that call. And you're one of those people because you have an impressive resume. You also have a pretty holistic view of what the field will be. I mostly want to talk about the future, or at least I think what's most important is the future, the near future, because the far future you can't really predict. And the past is the past, but the past is really important for understanding pattern recognition. And the far future is important for how we rank priorities in the near future and not just looking at what's immediately in front of us. So I want to talk about that. And you know, I will have given some of your intro in some of your bio in the intro to the show, but just talk to us about how you became to be one of the earliest partners of Shady Grove and how you helped to build that thing with your partners to what it came to be.
Right. Yeah. Again, thanks for having me. I feel the same way about the synergy. That's really been one of the hallmarks of what I've tried to do before Shady Grove and during Shady Grove is bring disparate or seemingly disparate groups and people together, academics and private practice and a whole variety of things. So this fit right in with that without, again, trying to sell anything. And my time with Shady Grove was both participating, but also at the feet of the masters. You've had them on, Mike Levy and Mark Siegel, tremendous assets to the field with who I was, and Art Sagoskin, and I'll get into the 3 partners in a second. But all of those, including your prior podcasts, are worthy of listening to for your audience. So my career, being the old guy, spans the arc of the fertility field in that I started prior to the time that there was any human IVF successful. Okay? So my fellowship was 77 to 79. So after college, I trained at Georgetown, Duke, and Harvard, NIH, and microsurgical training with Sir Robert Winston in Hammersmith Hospital. And that's interesting because that's a nostalgic, almost a relic now but that's what we used to do with the field. We had Clomid, we had inseminations, we had donor sperm, and we had microsurgery of one kind or another as a burgeoning field. And Sir Robert Winston was knighted because he pivoted from microsurgery, where he was world renowned, to becoming one of the foremost proponents of IVF. And so when I went into academics as a career manifest destiny towards the chairmanship, which is where my training was all destined to be, I became a professor and director at GW and started the IVF program there, one of the first in the US, with the first birth in Washington in 1983. And then trained a series of fellows, 7 of the 9 of whom became members of Shady Grove, which is an interesting way to recruit physicians, which we can get into. And then saw the limitations of academic practice. It wasn't entrepreneurial enough, as we needed to grow and develop and put resources and so on. So I left and joined Mike Levy and Art Sagoskin as the 3rd partner at Shady Grove Fertility, with Mark Siegel as the CEO. And 2 weeks later, we signed with Integramed because we needed capital to grow. And I've seen that entire component of benefit. I've seen downsides too, but I've seen the entire benefit of capital, private equity, and other, with Integramed, it was in MSO, and the ability and requirement to grow. We would not have grown the way we did without the support and capital of Integramed. We outgrew them after a while, and that's an interesting part of the story, but we needed an EMR. We needed to have people sign our loans without it being personal loans for growth and development. We needed to start insurance issues with an Arctic assisted reproductive technology insurance captive in the Caymans. We wanted to have retirement benefits that were stronger than our employees. We had really good ones for the employees, but we wanted different ones. And so all our employees went to Integramed. That wasn't the only reason, but it was helpful. So we then saw Shady Grove go from 3 physicians to now 85 or so, 150 cycles when I joined in 97 to over 10,000, 20 employees to now over 1,000. And now U.S. Fertility with another private equity partner, Amulet Partners. So I saw and I served there for 20 years as a medical director until becoming emeritus a couple of years ago, and now retiring as of December. So I've seen the arc of the fertility IVF field, and I have a vision, and not a unique one, but I have a vision from that perspective of what the future, near future anyway, may hold.
So if you signed with Integramed 2 weeks after you joined with the group, you must have known that you were going for the gusto, that this was to be a high growth venture. Was that part of what you were looking for?
Yes, but I wouldn't say a high growth venture. We were looking for an organic growth without as much risk. So we got a really nice, we called it right to manage fee, because they didn't take any equity. And there's all sorts of obviously private equity capabilities of equity, ownership, equity, and non-equity. But this was a non-equity one, which is really one of the reasons we went with them.
I don't really think of Integramed and organic in the same sentence, Bob.
Well, but that was our vision, and at least it was my vision. Mike Levy and Mark Siegel may have had greater ones. We really wanted to move from one lab to a bigger lab, okay, one a recovery room to a bigger recovery room, and all those things took money and time and hiring new people and so on. So it was, going from 150 cycles to 300. I mean, that's 100% growth, but I didn't envision 10,000 cycles down the road from Integramed. And in fact, Integramed's story with us was that as we grew bigger, they became less valuable to us. I think they were good for small practices, medium practices, where you needed HR, where you needed IT, where you needed marketing, where you needed a whole variety of services such as that, EMR. Okay, but as we grew bigger, then we needed our own. Marketing is local. They were in New York, and what did they know about the Washington market? They were experienced, but we did it locally. So we were duplicative. We had our own HR, our own IT, our own. Our IT staff now is huge. We had our own marketing and so on and so forth. So we kind of outgrew them, thanks to them. And I think that, and I've said publicly, or at least certainly within Shady Grove, that it became a little bit of what have you done for us lately? Okay, they couldn't really keep up, and that might have been internal to Integramed itself. Maybe personnel related. I really don't know the inner workings of why they couldn't keep up with us, but we were growing so quickly that it became limited. They still might have been very good for 1, 2, 3, 5 member practices, but not for something at Shady Grove. So my guess,
especially at that time, would have been that you were just such an outlier. There's only a few groups that are even in the ballpark of your size, especially maybe 10 years ago and or longer, and so that's probably why it probably just didn't fit with their scale to scale at the same speed.
Yeah. And their model was, if we do well, they do well, which is always a good one. There were other consolidation efforts even in the Washington area back in, this was the mid to late 1990s. And some of those failed, including in Washington, where they bought the practice and the physicians went on salary or small bonuses and so on and so forth. And the incentivization for the physicians collapsed. So I have my views on private equity and its effects on practice, good and at times not so good. and we chose the correct one. I was not involved with initially working with Shady Grove, working with Integramed. Mark Siegel and Mike and Art get the credit for that, as well deserved. But Integramed was interested in my practice, the size of it, because I was the professor at that point, you know, and academics was still an important component to all this. And so I had my name and my practice to bring with me. And that's why I came on April 1st. And I think it was the 14th of April of that year, we signed the documents with Integramed. So it was really, I was just one of the cogs in that wheel, but an important one in getting the valuation that Shady Grove wanted and needed.
So you've painted a picture of the pre-IVF REI field with microsurgery, then leaving the academic practice once IVF started to become profitable. So the early days of private practice, then ventures with corporate groups, whether it be management or equity, like Integramed, but also others. You're the medical director for a span of 20 years. And I'm making you give a highlight reel of 2 decades, but I'm making you do it now. And so when you think of, if you had to characterize to someone that was not familiar with fertility or coming into the field, how would you describe the changes that happened in the field in the 2 decades after that?
Some of them were predicated on scientific advancements, improvement in embryo culture, moving to blastocyst, ICSI, putting sperm into the egg to improve fertilization, advent of male fertility treatment and training, and cryopreservation, both changing the cryopreservation to be much more successful, utilizing a process called vitrification as opposed to slow freezing. And that also turned out to work for eggs, which is an important part of current and future. It turns out eggs, paradoxically, are much less resilient than our embryos to cryopreservation. You think it might be the opposite, but turns out no. So cryopreserving eggs was a big hurdle, and the freezing by vitrification with good people doing it, which is an important component, is an important part of the field, because egg freezing allows an expansion, one of the expansions into the consumer model, which we can talk about regarding the future. So I think part of it was scientific advancement, and part of it was planning and working off the spoke and hub model. So in Washington, we had our lab, and we built satellite offices around it to feed in for the egg retrievals and cost and lab intensive work. We then opened another lab in Baltimore, the same thing, and another lab in Philadelphia. We also had a model that we would go into cities that really had fragmented, weaker IVF programs, okay, of which we were one, okay, and weaker academic centers with IVF. And I'm not talking about weak overall medical centers. I mean, GW is fine. Great. Georgetown, of course, had its own issues with Jesuit and couldn't do IVF. Hopkins, obviously, is, Philadelphia has world premier medical centers, but their IVF programs are notably, typically weaker. And therefore, we could both utilize those and consolidate much more readily in there. And the art of war is one of my mantras by Sun Tzu, and not all of what Sun Tzu said involves you either have to make sure your supply lines are good, or you have to forage where you are, okay? But also that you don't necessarily pillage every place you take over. You can synergize with the medical centers there. You can synergize with other groups. You can consolidate for their benefit, which turns out to be your own. And I think that's a relatively unique concept with medical or many businesses in taking over in other areas. You don't have to be predatory. So there's much about the art of war that is less predatory than it might sound from the title. So those concepts of beneficent and consolidation within an area that might be ripe, including areas where there's a high income level based on zip codes, and low insurance areas as well, which is an unfortunate component of the success of fertility centers. Is there's not enough insurance for patients to afford it, therefore they have more self-pay, which we can get into, and scientific advancement. So I think all of those, again, you combine Mike Levy and Mark Siegel's, vision of, how to play those roles. I think of myself as the implementer, as the doer, as the organizer, as bringing the staff and everybody else into all that. And that's a good combination. Turned out to be a good combination.
So there's consolidation and expansion happening, and ways of being able to do it in a way where multiple parties are benefited. Sometimes maybe not, but this is all happening at a time where the REI landscape is shifting towards IVF. I think you and I talked about the bottleneck of REIs right now. When did that start to happen? When did you start to see that? Because when I talked to some of my friends that did fellowships in the late 80s, they said that REIs were coming out of fellowship and delivering babies. They weren't getting jobs in REI. And that's just very hard to picture. Contrast that today, and someone can make 250, 300,000 just about with any group if they're coming out of fellowship, because new docs are so in demand. And so when did that bottleneck issue start to happen across the country?
Well, I liken some of it back to my historical arc that I did earlier, in that when I left academics, again, I was trained with a desire and love still for academics to be a chairman. And that's why you went to Duke for OBGYN and Harvard for fellowship and so on. It wasn't to go out and, I mean, you could, but it wasn't necessarily go there with those laboratories and then back then to NIH to, have work-life balance. It was to be assistant professor. I think I still may be the youngest person to be a tenured professor at GW. I don't know if that still holds. And there's this rise that was anticipated, and the next step was to become a chairman. Okay. Well, there was a whole cadre, and I talked about this to friends of my age who were division directors, who instead of moving up to chairmanship, left academics, because they found the same limitations of the academic world with IVF. Small example. Okay. You don't know whether you're running cycles with timed egg retrieval. So you trigger, and 36 hours later, you have the egg retrieval. And once you trigger, you got to go, or you lose the eggs. Okay. And you don't know whether you're going to have 1, 2, or 10, in Shady Grove, maybe 20 or so a day. Okay. And you had to go first because you couldn't be at the end of the operating room list, because you never know how long the operating room will go, because every surgery is delayed or emergencies, what have you. So you had to take over a operating room every day that you might not even use at the beginning, which is the coveted spot for surgeons. Okay? And that's a very difficult thing to accomplish in an academic setting. Okay? There's a lot of pressure. Neurosurgeons want the first, understandably. Okay? And to have your own space for operating room is even more precious. So we hit a ceiling, and a whole bunch of us left. And that left a gap in the number of people who would then not only become division directors with training fellows, but also would become chairman to champion fellowship programs and fellowship. So I think you lost a certain proportion. How many? It's speculative, but you might have 60, 70, 80 fellowships now, or 50 instead of 45 or 46. But I think that was really, really part of it. And that helped create the bottleneck, and the demand made that bottleneck more apparent. If you didn't have a demand, 46 fellows a year would be fine. There was just a group of articles in the Fertility and Sterility, it might have been December, maybe November, December, I think it was, that talked about whether we should modify fellowship training, okay? Whether it should be bifurcated, whether it should be 3 years, 2 years, and what have you. And regardless of the outcome of that, it's really an interesting discussion that was had on the main pages of Fertility and Sterility. And prescient to this discussion, in January 2000, this year, January, or was it March? I forget which. There were the first 5 articles in Fertility and Sterility were about the business of practice, the business of fertility practice. It talked all about EBITDA, SWOTs, all sorts of things that you might not have expected to see, to show you how prominent it is in the field to have physicians try to be aware of the business aspects, separate from the question you asked, but an interesting, I mean, it just dropped in the last month or so.
What do you think some of those solutions are? Should there be double the number of fellowship programs? It sounds like if it weren't for that exodus of REIs leaving academic practice, there might be double the number. Could we easily support that? Should there be 80 or so fellowship programs? Should fellowship programs be 2 years? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think 80 is, is perhaps even a reach, but again, the whole thing is speculative. So, but I think that the field could afford to incorporate more than 46, okay? Because the bigger programs like U.S. Fertility and like the Ovation and like Prelude, a variety of other larger programs are going to continue to get bigger. Right now, 8% of the programs have about 25% of the volume. And a majority of that is from probably 5 or 6 programs. Okay? And that's going to continue. That's just going to, Darwinian. And there'll always be practices that have, as Mark Siegel put it, the people want a paycheck. And they want the work-life balance. They want to go home. They're not interested in a big, and that's terrific. There'll always be fellows for that, but there are going to be too few fellows, especially as individuals like myself reach retirement age and are left. And that's a whole another issue that's important to talk about, is how do you pay for the senior partners' retirement and keep the junior partners and associates solvent and happy. But I think you can certainly tolerate more fellowship programs. I don't think that's feasible to do. It's just not. You just don't come up with a fellowship.
Can we talk
program.
a little bit about how they get established? And maybe it's too elementary of a question for you, but I've often spoken to doctors who don't know, and so maybe it's good for people to understand how is it if University of Arizona wanted to start a new REI division in their, or at least a fellowship program in their hospital system, how does that happen?
Yeah, there's all sorts of criteria that the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology and the ACCME now utilize to minimal standards for a fellowship program. And that includes volume of not only IVF, but also infertility patients, of faculty training and faculty numbers, of laboratory capabilities for research. GW, I utilized NIH as sort of a huge laboratory. We had labs on site, but they had the ability, the fellows had an ability to go window shopping at NIH in order to gain their research capabilities. So there are very, very strict and difficult criteria to site visits, interviews that take some time to establish. It's just not, we'd like to do this, let's see if we can fill in the gaps. The gaps have to be filled in prior to approval. And that's one of the rate limiting factors. And I personally don't recommend a dilution of that. I think the solution might be some more, but at that high standard, that high level. Others argue that basically you're not doing surgery anymore. You can, you're doing IVF and egg retrievals, and your skills are limited, and the research that you do is somewhat perfunctory, I think that would be a lost art as well, more than nostalgia, because you don't understand the laboratory without having been in it. So I think that there'd be some room, but not easily done from a cost perspective, especially since the University of Arizona, I think was your example, doesn't want to put the money into IVF labs, embryologists, all the equipment and so on, with a limited number of cycles that they might very well be able to do. So there's a real tension there.
We're sailing from we've covered a bit of the past. We're in present. We're starting to sail into the near future, and I want to stay on this topic because I've thought about, there are, there's like I think Shady Grove is affiliated with 2 fellowship programs. Am I correct with that?
Mainly the National Fellowship Program in Reproductive Biology, the with NIH and Walter Reed, which is a great affiliation. We pretty much do a lot of the clinical research wing for them because of our volume, but also the clinical training of the fellows. They get a good amount of that at Walter Reed, but our volume is so valuable to them. So it's really a fine fellowship program, which of course is also a 3-year interview.
Right.
And so we're fortunate enough to have the pick of the litter in fellows coming out. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, really, is that we train fellows and we have a really great program towards partnership, which is another interesting thing to discuss if we have time. And therefore, we take a good number of the fellows for our offices, and that'll continue with U.S. Fertility. Compare a large proportion of fellows coming out of the fellowship each year.
So I've been thinking what the application are for there, and there's groups, Prelude partly owns and at least partly owns and operates the fertility division at NYU Langone, and so there's a number of these starting to happen. And I've wondered, well, what could the application be? And as you talk about, one of the deterrents for starting a new REI division or a new REI fellowship program is the cost. It could be it could be an inhibitor for the universities and health systems doing that. And if they had the opportunity to partner with some of these groups, could that be a solution?
Absolutely. And I have a history of that. I was a consultant to Beth Israel Hospital. A good friend of mine was the chairman there, and I put them together with Boston IVF. Okay. And one of the things I had recommended, which we then modeled at Shady Grove later, was bringing on a research scientist to help with the research. The clinicians wanted to do, and part of the idea of utilizing Boston IVF volume was to do clinical research. And both because it's good for the field and academics, but it also has a huge ROI on that. And that was something we realized at Shady Grove later on. And so I suggested that you don't want your physicians to be out of their lane or capabilities. You want them to be generating, like Boston IVF, you wanted them to be generating the volume of patients and the success rates and so on and so forth. But so you needed a research scientist with its overhead and team to utilize that research and turn it into publications and turn it into the field. In Shady Grove, we did exactly the same thing. When I came on board, we brought on a research scientist. Now we have a whole team of a research team. And again, there's a huge ROI on that. You get known in the field, you get referrals from across, you get international recognition and patients from cross-border reproductive care, besides giving back to the field. I was fortunate enough to have had a career, as we talked about, that spanned both. So I've been there, done that with the academics and now with private practice. But say Mike Levy would have been a superb academician. And he always kind of missed the idea of the research component of it. He was too valuable. Gratefully enough, he went into private practice. But so we satisfy some of those goals to give back to the field, really altruistically, because we felt we had a responsibility with that volume, but also there was an untapped ROI on that. So we also did that with Tampa. Okay. There was we opened the clinic there and took some people who were on the faculty, and we tried to make, instead of the art of war, as I mentioned earlier, instead of just competing with them, we tried to bring them on and synergize with them. And it helps if the academic center doesn't have to do the IVF on site anymore, for the reasons I stated earlier, for logistics of the operating room, costs, and so on and so forth. So they get the training program, okay, of infertility with expanded volume as well from the private practice. And they don't have to have, if they don't want to, they don't have to have the costs that having the IVF lab, the embryologist, the space, and so on and so forth. So it can be a real synergy. NYU Langone is a different story, of course, and another example of academics in private practice would be Cornell. They've managed, but that's New York, and those are sumo wrestlers banging into each other, as opposed to the model that I said was Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, where we kind of aggregated small disparate practices. There's no one dominant player because they're just all so big and powerful.
That makes sense given the market too. But as you're describing this potential for a public and private, or not public necessarily, but health system, academic and private partnership, it also seems that it could solve for a paradoxical effect that otherwise could happen, where, let's say, I know 60 might be a reach number, you might not want to dilute it to, but I'm just using 60 as an example of getting to 60 fellowship programs as opposed to 46. Well, then at the very least, we would need 14 more division chiefs. We would need that much more faculty. Right. And that would put a further burden on the supply that we have to meet the demand in the fertility field right now. Right. And that burden could be lightened by partnering with groups that either already exist or already have the resources, and so that you might not have to take as many REIs out of the field to train the additional people coming in.
You do need the philosophy, which is not universal, of that synergy. And I think that's one of the things I brought, was I think that synergy between academics and private practice is the ideal starting point that may not come to fruition in a particular market, but is the place to start. Okay. As well as, again, not being predatory, is taking trying to work with practices and bring them on that might be open to partnerships, as opposed to just, coming in and survival of the fittest, and burn the rest of the house down. So again, that doesn't work all the time, but if that's the starting point that you have, that it can work, much more frequently.
So we've come
let me finish one point, because to answer your question more directly, there's by the time you grow to 60 fellowship programs, as a truly hypothetical, but even if you could start today and said, and ABOG said, American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology, this is our goal. I don't know if they're saying that at all, but it would take a while to do that. And there's a demand for volume that is already there, that isn't going to wait for the several years to get up to 60. And that volume is related to not only some fertility benefits, both state insurance as well as consumer-driven insurance groups, Progeny and so on, but also consumer non-infertility demand, which is really going to be driving the field. Egg freezing, LGBTQ, cross-border reproductive care continuing or getting back, genetic testing for non-infertile people. You'll be at Gattaca soon, where you're picking embryos and for much more than genetic breaks and too many chromosomes, aneuploidy versus euploidy. So all of those are going to, I think, dramatically increase the volume of potential patients, clients for fertility practices, and that REIs won't be able to meet that. And we did this early on with Shady Grove, we with the nurse clinicians doing our HSGs and IUIs and ultrasounds. We brought on urologists that we had previously farmed out stuff. We still farm out our GYN surgery, but I think the next wave may be bringing on GYNs to do surgery, including egg retrievals and so on, and leaving REIs to be a much more narrowed focus of cycle monitoring and patient management, both from telemedicine, artificial intelligence, and genetic advancement.
So now we're sailing into the future. You mentioned Gattaca, and we talked about how we got here. What are some of the ways to meet the demand? And so we could possibly, ABOG could possibly start to help build more fellowship programs, but even that would take a long time. That would only satisfy some of the demand. One thing that's happening right now is I used to hear a lot of people, except for Dr. Kiltz, and this isn't private conversation with Dr. Kiltz because he's been on the show twice, and I invite people to go listen to those episodes where he has insisted for a long time that either other OBGYN physicians or advanced providers can be doing a lot of what many REIs are doing right now. And when I've only been in the field 7 years, Bob, people used to poo-poo that idea a lot, and I hear a lot less resistance to it now. Is that something that's inevitable?
Yes. I think it is because of the supply and demand. Again, these are highly capable, well-trained people. And some of the stuff we do, if we can turn the volume down, isn't so hard. We can turn the volume back up, and that's easy to say, from somebody who's done it for so long, but it really is true. And so therefore, you need to supply to meet the demand. And as the demand increases, the supply will be greater, including when people retire, and want their way out. How will you be able to fill that? So I think that the ability to sorry about the phone there.
Well, let's pause just for one second and then pick that just after the phone's done ringing. Then we'll pause and then take it back up from the top of that thought. Once
it's actually a landline. Imagine that. That's used as an emergency, but we get
somebody's trying to get you to donate blood or to wire money overseas or
right. So I think that's over.
Okay. I'm trying to think of what part of the thought that it's inevitable.
I think it's inevitable that we will have additional personnel to do a fair amount of what reproductive endocrinologists do now, including HSGs, although we have nurse clinicians doing that already, IUIs, monitoring, egg retrievals, and the reproductive endocrinologist will be in a somewhat supervisory overseer role, as well as interviews and telemedicine and so on and so forth. And I see that as an inevitable means by which to help the supply.
What needs to happen in order for the quality of care and the advancement of treatment to remain at the same level? Because otherwise we would be saying, well, I guess you don't need a 3-year fellowship after all. Guess you just wasted those 3 years after residency. And either that's true or it isn't. And there are other things that we need to account for as OBGYNs, nurse practitioners, and PAs are trained to do those things that you mentioned.
Right. Well, it might get better, not worse, depending on the individual physician. There's a spectrum of reproductive endocrinologists, and there's a spectrum of gynecologists who haven't been trained as not aggressively as widely. And I'll bet those two spectrums overlap. But that isn't the main point. The idea is that there'll be a narrower work that the reproductive endocrinologist will be responsible for, protocols, monitoring decisions.
That's all right. We can you left it at a pretty easy place to pick back up. So
This is an ongoing thing with my wife, who doesn't want to be without a landline.
That sounds, yeah, it sounds like a similar story. So, but that's okay, because
Yeah.
you were we got through the main point, which was about what
Right.
of how our age, but you were
Some of that's also going to be artificial intelligence, not only in the laboratory with the selection of embryos, but also in IVF protocols. So you'll put in age, BMI, AMH, FSH, antral follicle count, and so on and so forth. The antral follicle count may very well have been done by an AI-driven ultrasound machine, even perhaps remotely at the patient's home. And you put that in, and the protocol will come out of the artificial intelligence big data set. Okay, so some of that decision making from the reproductive endocrinologist will be taken over, aided by, enhanced by the AI. And therefore, some of that will become less necessary to have the highest level of reproductive endocrinologists. I still think that they will be the forefront of care for patients and interface with patients. But I think there are a number of tasks that, just like we do now, we farmed out our myomectomy, our fibroid surgery, our tubal surgery, which again, when that's done, our ectopic surgery is all now done by gynecologists or even oncologists who are, anxious to do more surgeries. We could bring that in-house as well, and even, get reimbursed, for it. So I think that there'll always be the reproductive endocrinologist, much more fitting the volume that there are, for that.
So what's the daily responsibility of the REI going to look like in 20 years, Bob? Are we talking about a doc that's in front of a screen the size like Tom Cruise in Minority Report, where he's just pulling he's supervising hundreds of caseloads at a time on a giant screen, and there are just divisions of teams and processes that are allocated to each pillar of cases? Is that what it's going to look like?
Well, 20 years is a really long time, but it might. But I see one patient at a time on the screen, and again, with both telemedicine, which the pandemic has pushed forward quite a bit regarding the comfort level of that, but also that's going to continue. I think home monitoring will help some, especially with populations of individuals, not patients, who don't want to come to the clinic, who don't want to be with the sick people, if you will. A good example of that is another academic downfall is that often the space you had for waiting room for your infertile patients was also the waiting room for the obstetrical patients, because it's an OB/GYN department. So say what you will about that, patients didn't really want to mix that way. So you have a woman who wants egg freezing or is there for genetic analysis of embryos prior to putting them back, but isn't infertile. Though they may feel less comfortable coming into the clinic every day, or more amenable to remote monitoring. It's also helpful for people at work, to not have to come into the clinic every day. So it's not only the consumers. So I think all of that's going to play a role, and some automation in the laboratory with AI. I'm not sure about the embryologist in a box concept yet, with doing the insemination and culturing and so on. I don't know if that's going to make it, but it's already being talked about as being an acceptable product. So 20 years, I don't know. I give it 5 years, and there'll be the need for more ancillary personnel. I'll give you a little background. Art Sagoskin, superb infertility specialist, is not a reproductive endocrinologist. Okay, he started the fertility center with another gynecologist, and then brought Mike Levy on, and then it became the Shady Grove Fertility Center. And then one of the other people left, and then I joined Mike and Art. But so this is a good example of, now he's had 20 something years experience, well, almost 30 years experience at it, but he was just a very fine surgeon, a laparoscopic surgeon, and all sorts of experience. And he doesn't do that anymore either. But Shady Grove was started with a non-REI. Go figure that. Huh?
There are still a few of those folks left, and I can think of one that we work with that is a really great fertility doctor, but same thing. Didn't do a 3-year REI fellowship. That was a while ago, and so yeah. I think that was, those folks were grandfathered in,
right?
Many
exactly.
of them, exactly. And now it's coming back to that. It
right.
seems to be.
I think from my bias, if you will, from academics and REI training and training of fellows, that there is real value in the depth of the fellowship training to making them superb clinicians. How necessary that is, especially at certain tasks, is what I think volume will alter. Now, I don't want to minimize the importance of the reproductive endocrine academic training, but I don't think it's an absolute necessity for everything fertility.
How should it alter the program?
How should
as volumes alter the needs, as volumes alter what REIs will actually be doing, how should that alter the curriculum of a training program?
Well, I'm still in favor of the 3-year program. I think some more of that could be fertility based and IVF laboratory based, rather than some of the other pediatric menopausal work that covers it. So I don't know if you could have tracks, but I'm interested in being a fertility specialist. I'm interested in staying in academics and dealing with menopause and birth control, and I'm interested in pediatric reproductive, so maybe there are tracks that can allow more time focused, as opposed to everybody doing the same 3 years.
I had this conversation about, well, it must have been right before COVID, because it was in person, and it was with a younger doc about my age and a really good doctor. And we were talking about this dynamic of many of the responsibilities being shifted to other OBGYNs or advanced providers. And he's thought about it. It wasn't like I brought this entire perspective to him for the first time, but he thought, like, what are we going to be doing in 20? Is my job going to be irrelevant? And I thought, no way is your job going to be relevant. You're going to be managing so many more cases.
Right.
Right. What else are they going to be, for those thinking, well, if I'm not going to be doing the retrievals, if I'm not going to be doing IUIs, am I going to be irrelevant in a decade or 3? How would you assuage their concerns?
Well, I think that they don't have to not do the retrievals. I think there's just, instead of having 7 reproductive endocrinologists doing 1 day a week, you do your day a week, but that's 3 or 4 reproductive endocrinologists, and the other 3 days are well-trained surgical gynecologists. So it's not, I don't think it's an either or. I'm kind of more worried about who'll be controlling the clinic in which they're working. Is it a private equity ownership, or is it are physicians still the primary managing partners to make those decisions.
Why does that matter?
Because I think that the physicians have an ROI in mind, but it isn't the primary focus, or shouldn't be. It can't be lack of knowledge, as the Fertility and Sterility 5 articles points out, and Mark's training us at Shady Grove in IBIDA and other important dynamics. But if you have complete ownership of a fertility practice, then people talk about, I keep hearing in consultations, 357. It's like a new word, you know, that they're going to be out, the private equity will be out in 357 years. I said, I didn't know that word, 357. And that's, I think, a dangerous is not the right word, but is a difficult concept to make a longer term and much bigger ROI. Integramed, for instance, was an MSO, but that was a 25-year contract. You know, that's putting themselves and the clinic on the same track. If you win, we win, we win, you win, for 25 years, not 357. Now,
no, but as you pointed out, you outgrew Integramed at that point.
Yeah, but we're pretty much the only ones who did that, you know, of the 20 Integramed programs. I forget exactly how many. We were just about the only one who outgrew it. So there's still a role for that. But if again, a clinic in Washington, which was bigger than us back in 97, they lasted about 3 years before they completely imploded. We took one of their physicians after that, actually a couple of their physicians after that, because their model that they joined, and I don't know what they got out of it, you know, money and all, I don't know. I don't have a clue of that. But the model was basically they were on salary, and the incentive to grow just died. And maybe I think it was FICOR or whatever the private equity got out of it, maybe they were happy and maybe they sold it to somebody else. I don't know, but I don't see that as being the best model regarding equity position in the fertility market. I may be biased, but importantly, I think that most physicians who are going to be making the decisions as to who to go with would have a similar bias.
Bob, you've given us so much to think about with the field, from how it started to how we got to a bottleneck capacity as supply and demand start to totally separate from each other, to what the future will look like with artificial intelligence, with at-home testing, and different ways of training other providers to be able to do things in the field. How do you want to conclude with what you see happening in the next 5 years? And maybe we say, what's your best case scenario if a magic wand was waved and the best things in your mind happened in the next 5 years? What would that look like? And then what would be the cautionary tale that you'd leave us with?
I think the future will be more consolidation. Bigger groups will get bigger. There will still be some mom and pop shops, and I don't say that in a pejorative way. I think they're great, including people who want to, you know, have a salary and go home and work-life balance. They're going to be more and more difficult to recruit to the partners that exit, and the bigger groups will have the capital to grow and utilize the expenses that go with artificial intelligence and take care of the growing demand, whether it be much greater growth from consumer non-infertility patients combined with a steady increase in infertility patient use. The cautionary tale is 357, is equity ownership and a flip. And that will hurt patients, ultimately, hurt practices as well, and be detrimental to the field. And I worry about the FOMO, you know, and everybody going over the cliff, exacerbated by more and more retirements. So I think that's the cautionary tale as as I see it. But hopefully we'll be able to treat through advances in technology, treat a whole lot more people, including infertile patients.
Dr. Stillman, Bob, thank you very much for coming on Inside Reproductive Health.
It's a pleasure, and thanks for doing what you do at Fertility Bridge.